I think we'll get started. Everyone, welcome. There's folks joining in, and I guess that'll can happen through the brief introduction and setup. It's such a pleasure to have all of you join us today from all over, really, between India and here. There's a world, and I see the world gathering on our screens around us. We're here today for a discussion between Amitav Ghosh and Adam Sobel around the topic of unlikely stories, apprehending climate change in the Anthropocene. My name is Nikhil Anand, and I'm an associate professor of anthropology and the topic director for the Penn program in environmental humanities this year, convening around the topic of elements. And together with Bethany Wiggin and Meg Arenberg, we're delighted that you can join us here. This is a year which despite the best laid plans for all of us, have been disrupted by events more than of our making. And it's a good time to talk about ways in which we might inhabit improbable events and the uncanny. As improbable events increasingly disrupt pretenses of legible, predictable worlds, how might we notice and narrate and inhabit the uncertain, vibrant nature cultures of our times? What kinds of stories around climate, COVID might we tell and sense from here and with here? We're delighted to have the opportunity to speak with Amitav Ghosh and Adam Sobel today. They've been in conversation for some time, a conversation that I and many others have been privileged to read about in Amitav's book, The Great Derangement, and particularly as it was framed around the improbable. We thought it might be a generative time to revisit that conversation today, many years after it first began. Amitav Ghosh, as many of you know, all of you know, is a multi-award-winning author, a prolific writer, one who for at least 2 decades has been thinking and writing not just of climate change, but also the difficulties of feeling and thinking and writing the slow and spectacular anthropogenic formations that climate change has now become amidst our focus and our preoccupations on the everyday. While I recounted his more lengthy biography in the introduction to his keynote lecture, I thought I'd just quickly highlight his 2 most recent books here, The Great Derangement and Gun Island, books that describe climate change as a crisis, not just of science or politics, but also of the imagination. In these books, he urges a sensory reattunement to and in the world, and also to attend to stories as more than human practices. Professor Adam Sobel and is affiliated to the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory at Columbia University. As an atmospheric scientist, his research focuses on examining the changing features of tropical cyclones and has written a fair amount about cyclone prediction in recent times. His book, Storm Surge, Hurricane Sandy, Our Warming Planet, and the Extreme Weather of the Past and Future, published in 2014, weaves together biography, climate science, the history of climate science, into a compelling narrative around prediction and responses, both affective and scientific, to Hurricane Sandy, a hurricane that he was in New York at the time to experience. He also has a wonderful new podcast that I've been catching up on these last few weeks, Deep Convection, which also hosted Amitav Ghosh not so long ago, but also many others, including Naomi Oreskes. So we look forward to discussing and talking with both of you in the next hour and a half. A couple of quick logistical points or matters I'd just like to put out there. This is a moderated discussion, so we'd appreciate if you could keep your microphones muted unless you're called upon to ask a question or make a comment. that also reduces the feedback and makes the audio more intelligible for all. We'll have a structured discussion. I prepared some talking points, but I hope Amitav and Adam will also, I'm sure, will have a lot to talk with each other about for about 45 minutes to an hour, with the remaining time to take questions from all of you who've gathered here. You can participate in the discussion even before the open discussion by using the chat window that you can open on the right-hand side of your screen, and also use that space to ask questions of either or both Amitav and Adam in the coming hour. In the event of connectivity issues, I would ask you to turn off your video feed, but assuming things go as planned, feel free to use video as and how you're comfortable doing so. A quick note on conviviality in this new medium that we're all getting used to very quickly, my 4-year-old son included. We come together on Zoom as a community committed here not only to intellectual work, but also committed to an ethics of conviviality. And thinking with this text that has been prepared by the Society of Cultural Anthropology, we expect those who create and participate to sustain this community over the next hour to treat one another with respect, dignity, kindness, and consideration. Disagreement and debate is most welcome when done in the spirit of engagement and not antagonism. Harassment, bigotry, and disrespect will not be tolerated, and you might be asked to leave the session. These virtual spaces are wonderful to bringing us together, but we've also experienced virtual spaces in other ways ever since the promise of Facebook and Twitter to bring people together. It's also driving people apart. That said, let's make the most of this opportunity and to have a generous and generative discussion. So welcome, Amitav, welcome, especially Adam, who's, despite suffering back problems, has kindly agreed to join us on this session. And thank you both for coming here and being with us today at these crazy, crazy times. Maybe if I can ask, maybe we can get started by asking after how the conversation between the two of you got started, Amitav and Adam, around storm surge, around thinking about cyclones and hurricanes in New York and Mumbai. Can you say a little bit about what those first conversations were like and what you talked about? What did you find thinking between New York and Mumbai as you did?
Shall I go first?
Sure.
You can hear me okay? Well, Adam, you're looking better. I hope you're feeling better.
Thank you.
Yes?
It's slow. It's slow. Yeah, I'm still living on a yoga mat on the floor, but but moving about when I need to.
That's good.
Thank you.
So I read Storm Surge. I think it was back in 2014 or 2015. And it made a really powerful impression on me. It's just a great book because, you know, the science is incredibly rigorous. At the same time, there are all these interesting asides and, you know, sort of human dimensions to the story. How he goes out and, you know, sees the rain coming down and, you know, how important it was for him to actually witness this. I just loved the book. So after that, you know, I wrote to him out of nowhere. Really, I found his email somewhere. I think it was on his university website or something. And I wrote to him and said, "Look, I loved your book, and you know, can I come and talk to you?" So you know, I trekked uptown to Adam's apartment where he's lying now, and interviewed him at great length. And basically, at that moment, I was trying to sort of figure out the storm surge risks for Mumbai. And Adam was incredibly helpful. And really after that, you know, we kept in touch about it. And then it turned out that Columbia University has this program in Mumbai. So Adam was able to go there, and he's been working quite systematically. It's now a matter of 3 or 4 years that he's been working on, you know, developing, you know, some sort of storm surge scenario for Mumbai. So, you know, I like to think that, you know, sometimes something good comes out of writing. And this was one good thing that came out of writing that book.
Yeah, I can add. My memory of it is totally consistent, but from the other side, I remember getting an email from Amitav. The book came out in fall 2014, and I think I got an email, maybe it was summer of 15. And he said, I really enjoyed your book. I'm a writer too, and I've been thinking about the risks to India, or maybe Mumbai specifically, I don't remember, of cyclones, and can I discuss this with you? I, at that time, had never read any of Amitav's books, but I knew the name. I mean, he's a famous writer, and I knew who he was. And I was, my first reaction was just to be deeply flattered that a writer of his stature appreciated my book. It made me feel like I must be a real writer now. My book didn't sell a lot of copies, but I think of the audience as very small quantity, but high quality. And this is one of the great things that came out of it. Anyway, as he says, he came uptown and he was interested in what I remember is that after Sandy, Amitav was thinking, could this happen in Mumbai? And he asked me that question. And at that time, I didn't know anything about Mumbai other than that they make the movies there, really. But I knew that the Arabian Sea has relatively few cyclones, but they do have some. So I started to, my first reaction was it's possible, but unlikely. And there are several coincidences that happened. One, as Amitav mentioned, is that it turned out that Columbia has a small outpost, they call it a global center, in Mumbai, and we were able to get a little bit of funding to study the problem. The other is that we had been doing research for a couple of years to develop a model, a sort of scientific tool, to assess exactly this kind of problem, the kind of problem where a storm is very unlikely, very rare, so you can't estimate the probability from history because it's happened maybe not at all, or so rarely that you can't just count the number of times, over a number of years to see the risk. So we were already Mumbai was a perfect case because it sort of set up for a perfect disaster with a cyclone, because it's possible, but it's so rare that it hasn't happened in the modern history, and thus the city hasn't prepared for it because they've never seen it happen. Although it turned out that at that time, if you looked on Wikipedia, this was another strange aspect of the story, you would see that Wikipedia and many other books on which the Wikipedia article was based said that there had been a major cyclone in 1882 in Mumbai that had killed 100,000 people. And after some research, we determined that that wasn't true. I communicated with a lot of scientists, including in India. Turned out that wasn't true, so it was quite strange. The whole story was quite strange. Anyway, it led, as Amitav said, to me going to Mumbai a few times, working on this project about surge risk there. We wrote one scientific paper on it. That specific project isn't continuing, but it's led to more engagement with people in India and another project we're doing now on the monsoons. So yeah, I guess the one other thing I wanted to say is just to refer to Amitav's keynote lecture from a couple of days ago, where at some point near the end, he said that he'd spend most of his life in his career living in a literary world. And at some point, his awareness of climate change made him realize that he had to think differently and work differently somehow, and leave the confines of the way he'd been doing his storytelling. And looking back on this time, Sandy, and then the period after, including this whole experience with Amitav, which led to a whole lot of more discussions about climate change and how it affects human beings and how human beings are behaving in this situation. It was kind of a similar transformation for me in a way of trying to understand my role in the world as a scientist and my responsibility as someone in a position of sort of privilege and authority, even if only in a small way as an academic. So maybe we can talk more about that in the last hour and a half, but it was sort of it came at what, looking back on it, was a big moment for me.
Adam, if I may just step in for a moment. It's true that you hadn't been in Mumbai or in India, but you had been working in Bangladesh for quite a while, hadn't you? And you'd written a report on Bangladesh, as I remember.
Yeah, I'd actually been to India too a couple of times, but that's true. Yeah, we did a report for the World Bank on cyclone risk in Bangladesh. So I had been thinking about the region and so on. Yes.
And you'd been working on the oscillations, so that was another connection.
Right. Yes.
Adam, I want to come back to what you said about the rarity of cyclones hitting Mumbai. That's just actually an anomaly. It's just an anomaly of the last 120 years because, as we went through the record, we found that from the mid 18th century onwards, Mumbai had been hit repeatedly. Wasn't there a cyclone in 1757 which more or less flattened the city? And, in the historical record, there's quite a number of cyclones that's been, that have either had near misses or have actually devastated the city. Secondly, it would be interesting if you could talk about the work of that Japanese scientist, the one you sent to me, this
Yeah.
strange situation of, cyclones intensifying in the Arabian Sea and the record we've seen of late.
Yes, that's right. First, just to add to your first comment, I mean, those storms that you mentioned, I haven't, like in 1757 and so on, I haven't, I'm aware that those are there in the record. I don't know the details of them because they came before the time of modern data. So maybe there's old historical sources, but I don't know. But what is clear is that even in the modern period, there have been quite a few that have hit nearby. I mean, Gujarat has been hit several times by some pretty intense ones. And so if those storms had just turned right, they could have hit Mumbai, and somehow they seem not to do that in the modern times, but that's just like all the storms when Sandy made a left turn. That had never happened in modern times either, so it's just sort of very parallel. But the main part of the question was about the global warming trend. Yes, so right now, in the historical record, the North Indian Ocean has the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea, and the Bay of Bengal has many more cyclones in a normal year, and so the east coast of India is much more exposed to cyclones than the west coast. So many people in India who live on the west coast think it's not a problem for them, it's only a problem on the east coast. But the global warming projections, the models are quite consistent that the Arabian Sea will warm more than the Bay of Bengal. So it's not just a uniform global warming, but it's disproportionate. Because of the way the monsoon changes, it affects the ocean. And so the cyclones are projected to increase in the Arabian Sea so that they'll be more common on the west side than they are historically. And there's actually been an increase in the last 10 years. There have been quite a few intense cyclones in the Arabian Sea, quite anomalous. And my interpretation would have been that that's just a fluke because it's too small numbers to sort of detect a trend. But some scientists at Princeton, first Japanese, Hiro Murakami is his name. He first did this in Japan and then came to Princeton where he is now, has done a bunch of studies that show not only that the trend is projected for more storms in the Arabian Sea, which increases the risk to Mumbai, but that the recent increase is already attributable to that, is their claim. That needs more studies by others, but it's very credible work, and it's compelling thus far.
The thing is, you remember there was the major cyclone that hit, there have been several that have hit Gujarat, but also some that have hit Sindh in Pakistan. And there was one that hit Karachi. The thing is, Karachi has a hinterland. Mumbai doesn't have a hinterland. That's what really struck me. In my first conversation with you, one of the things that I was trying to point out is that, New York, even though it was devastated by Hurricane Sandy, but New York does have the barrier islands, and those outlying islands. So New York is, in a sense, a little bit protected. The trouble with Mumbai is that Mumbai has absolutely no protection at all. It's just this long sliver of, and between that and and Antarctica, there's nothing. So there'll be that long fetch that you write about, with the storm surge. There'll be nothing to break the surge. And worst of all, Mumbai would be impossible to evacuate, as we've seen during this pandemic.
Yeah. Yes. It's a classic case because it's so vulnerable, as you say, and it's very flat. Of course, Mumbai is also a story of land use and development. It used to be just a bunch of flat, sort of sandy islands. One or two of them had a little bit of hill on them, but it was just a string of islands, and then it's been filled over time by the British and then post-colonial by the Indian state as well. So there's almost no elevation, so it's very susceptible to flooding. Of course, Mumbai has had serious floods in the last few years. In 2005, a quite awful one. and then a few in the last few years that have been almost that bad, maybe not quite as bad as that. And those weren't caused by cyclones, they were just caused by rain. The real threat from a cyclone would be storm surge, wind pushing the ocean up onto the land. So there's no doubt the city is flood prone and people there know that, but the question is whether a cyclone could be worse. I think maybe it could be. And the people who would be exposed would be both the rich people along Marine Drive and so on, and the financial district and everything, as well as very poor people in low-lying slums, Dharavi and others further north. So it's very vulnerable. Yes, that's true. And evacuation, I mean, is sort of inconceivable. I mean, in my trips there, I felt that the science wasn't really that original or important that we were doing. What we were doing was trying to draw attention to the risk and just get people to plan, because what we learned in Sandy was that the local, state, and federal governments actually responded quite well in Sandy. I mean, they did a few things wrong in hindsight, but they were well prepared because they'd been studying the problem for a long time. So they didn't have to figure out what to do in the moment. And Mumbai, that process didn't seem to have been there. They started a lot of process of thinking it through after 2005, but they didn't really consider cyclones. They didn't really consider the possibility of evacuating large portions of the city, which would be the way to save lives in the event. And in our trips there, we tried to have meetings with different people. And what we found was that academics and activists were easy to talk to, but government officials were very cagey and invasive. And at one point, after a lot of effort, we got a meeting with the main disaster management official. And I asked him if he was prepared for a cyclone. This is the guy whose really job it is. And he wasn't very happy to talk to us, but he said, yes, if there's a cyclone, we know how to warn the fishermen on the coast and something. And I said, no, not a minor cyclone that affects the fishermen on the coast. What if it really floods the whole city like 2005, but worse? And he literally threw up his hands. I mean, physically, he said, what am I supposed to do? How can I evacuate people in this city? Where am I going to move them and how am I going to do it? Because it's very congested, everything, there's no place to go. So that was a sort of frank admission, and it reminds me a bit of the Trump response to COVID in a way that we're seeing now, which is just to sort of pretend it's not, getting closer to pretending it's not happening or can't happen.
Yeah, I want to actually ask about this because there's something really interesting going on in what you just described. First is in terms of there's studies that are done, risk management studies that are done that are oftentimes trying to map risks of cyclones based on data of times past to project the future, right? And I think what you were saying a little bit earlier, Adam, was about how that's completely insufficient, because the 120-year span that you and Amitav are talking about was an exceptional moment and not something that will map onto the future. So maybe if you can say a little bit more about that, about the models about future cyclone projection, but then also more broadly around data. You talked about in the book, and Amitav, you described in Great Derangement as well, the tremendous risk presenting a lot of data that an event like a cyclone might have for New York, for Mumbai. If a cyclone can turn left, it can turn right. So what is the difficulty around this data being fully addressed by government officials or by policymakers in the exchanges that you've had?
Well, I can tell a couple of things. First, about the inadequacy of historical records. The people that actually know the most about this is the insurance industry and reinsurance industry, because they had a couple of big losses, starting with Hurricane Andrew in the early 90s in Florida, that were bigger losses than they'd experienced before. And they realized that the historical data weren't an adequate guide, and they developed what's called catastrophe models, which is basically you make a lot of synthetic events that are similar to ones that have occurred in the past, but just different enough that you can generate sort of an artificial history that's much longer. And from that, you can estimate the risk of rare events. And the question is always whether you've done it right. And also in the past, the private sector models, reinsurance people haven't accounted for climate change really. Until now, they're trying to do that, but we try to do that. So that's one thing. The other story I can tell about data though, is that in order to do what we haven't done in our work is, or haven't done well enough to our satisfaction, is actually predict the storm surge itself, which requires a different kind of model. We have a colleague who's very good at it, who's working on it. But the basic thing you need to do it is you need a topographic map of the city that's very accurate. You need to know the elevation of everything. And you need to know the elevation also of everything under the water, because that affects the storm surge. And that data, you can get satellite data sets that are public, but they're too coarse for this purpose. They have too many problems. They see a building and they're based on radar, and they see a top of a building or a tree and they think it's the ground. They don't really know where the ground is in a dense city. And you really want LiDAR data sets, which is taken from an aircraft with a laser, and those are quite accurate. And Indian government has done that in Mumbai, but they won't give the data to us. And not only they won't give it to us, they won't give it to Indian researchers. So we had a meeting in Mumbai with a lot of colleagues from India, from universities and so on. And we said, you know, it's really frustrating. We can't get this data. And the Indian researchers practically screamed and tore they said, don't tell us this. We are so angry. We can't get it either. And we work for the Indian, you know, the universities are government universities. So it's controlled by the defense ministry. And it's somehow perceived as having some military sensitivity. Like if you knew exactly the topography of Mumbai, somehow you could give that data to Pakistani terrorists or something. And that would somehow, I mean, it's wrapped up in some old colonial era laws so that's something that, you know, we can do a poor job of predicting storm surge. Another consequence of it is that I talked to some of the hydrologists, the people who actually study flooding in Mumbai. You know, there's IIT Bombay, there's a whole bunch of excellent universities with excellent scientists who study floods, and none of them study the flood risk in Mumbai where they live for precisely this reason. They can't get the data. They do research in rural areas where they can get the data. So rural flooding in India is much better studied than the cities where the experts live, even though the risk there is, not only is the risk high, they've experienced a massive flooding in the last 10 years. So that's just sort of a strange story about data.
I should point out that one of the great experts on the topography of Mumbai is here, Anuradha Mathur, and she and her partner did a wonderful exhibition on how Mumbai came to emerge out of these 6 islands.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yes, and that was very helpful for me when I was trying to understand the risks. And maybe Anuradha will have something to say later. But I'd like to say that what's very clear to me from their work is that essentially all those parts of Mumbai that have been filled in between these 6 islands, 6 or 7 islands, that they are reverting to the sea. You know, the sea is reclaiming its own. And what is, again, really scary about that is that, you know, Mumbai has 2 nuclear installations on either side. Each of these installations is just as vulnerable as the Fukuyama installation, you know. So the level of risk to Mumbai is such that it's almost beyond contemplation, you know.
And it's increasing as well because there's a lot of development that's occurring with a new airport and a new port and roads and stuff. And it's going, a lot of it is going in the most vulnerable spots along Tana Creek around the sort of estuary where there's some swampy land that's, you know, it's always tempting to build on that because it's what tends to be some of the only undeveloped land, as often happens in cities with this kind of topography. So new infrastructure is going in that's going to be even more vulnerable. Just the pressure to develop is so strong, and there's nothing to no really force that can hold it back.
Yeah, I think this is like one of the points you also both made in your work when you describe the longer histories of making these disasters, right? That it does not just happen with Sandy in the moment or the cyclone, but that these histories are made, these disasters are made over a certain way of relating and trying to make the city predictable and legible through bureaucratic planning operations and the like. I was wondering, you know, both of you have thought a lot about improbability and preparing for the improbable. Amitav, in your book, you described humans as being catastrophists for most of their history, and even most humans today, or many humans today, right? What might catastrophist ways of being and inhabiting the planet look like, and how might they be different from the bourgeois modes of living as we have been for some time? Some of us have been for some time.
Well, you know, I just read, just as I was sitting down here, I read a really interesting piece in a magazine called High Country, where, you know, he quotes from my book and says that our inability to imagine catastrophe ensures that the catastrophe will happen, you know. I still don't know if people are able to imagine catastrophe in that way. I think it's by no means clear, especially in relation to this pandemic. I mean, you could see the desperate urge to, not think about it, to not think it, which is again, what the Trump administration seems to want, that let's just pretend it's not happening. Springs from that kind of mindset, where people are just not able to get their minds around the disasters that lie ahead.
I mean, it's worth adding that, just to be a little more political, this is one of the cases, like many, most of these disasters, even though it's true that people have a hard time understanding it, it was very much predicted by the scientists who know about these things. I mean, you can read Mike Davis's book on the avian flu, which, if you read that, everything that's happening now sort of almost happened about 5 or 10 times over the last couple of decades, not to mention the 1918 flu. And, President Obama had set up a task force to prepare the government for exactly this eventuality. Trump disbanded it. So I think what we're seeing now with the kind of the shift to more authoritarian regimes in many parts of the world, and certainly in the United States and India, is also it comes together with a rejection of expertise and science, which is not to say that the experts are always right or that there shouldn't be a democratic sort of vetting. It's not to say that scientists or technocrats should make all the decisions, but a lot of these disasters really are predicted. And what we're seeing now with COVID, for climate scientists, the whole thing has been really spooky because we saw everything that we're used to experiencing being experienced by the epidemiologists, but much, much faster. We saw them go through the whole thing of like trying to present the evidence and kind of, the denial and the politicization and the everything. It's just been quite, it's like a deja vu, except it's a deja vu where everything happens at 100 times the speed, because the pace of the pandemic compared to climate change, of course, is much faster.
I would like to add to that, though, that this whole idea of denial, I think, is a misreading of what's actually afoot. And that's increasingly clear in this pandemic thing. I mean, look, Trump believes in the science. He gets himself checked every day. Right. He does, Mike Pence does, they all do. They're checking themselves all the time.
Yes.
So basically, it's not that they don't believe in the science or that they don't know what is happening. Similarly, Trump buys insurance for climate insurance for his properties. So of course he knows. What they're not saying is what cannot be said in this sort of liberal democratic form of governance, which is their policy is social Darwinist. Their policy is the devil take the hindmost. It's as clear as that. And it's become perfectly clear to me now that this is going to be their policy in relation to climate change as well. And it's not just Trump. Let's admit it. It's a broad section of the American political elite, and beyond that, a very large section of American society that actually have come to believe in these narratives that the devil will take the hindmost. The people who suffer the most are the poor, the Black, the Hispanics, and so on. And that's not without foundation. We know it to be true. But that narrative, which we on the left have been, as it were, spearheading for a long time, I think it's had the opposite effect. It's had the effect of making certain demographics, privileged demographics, feel that they're more or less immune, or that they have protections. The great irony of this, of course, is that actually the hindmost is the USA, on all these matters. Because look, in terms of the pandemic outcomes, the USA is what? One of the worst affected. Similarly, over the last 4 or 5 years, it's been perfectly clear that no country has been harder hit by climate change than the US. And one of the reasons for that, I think, Adam, just as you in the sciences are always sort of projected towards the future, or, your gaze is directed at the future, because your models are also directed at the future. I think about this always in terms of the past. in terms of how these ideas, these ideologies come to be rooted within a long history. And in the context of America, I think you simply cannot escape, the history of settler colonialism. It's absolutely rooted in that, the whole idea that you let the Native Americans, you don't actually, you don't actively necessarily kill them, but you let these impersonal forces devastate them. And that's absolutely the thinking. It's this Malthusian, social Darwinist kind of logic which is behind this today. And it's, it's really, truly horrifying to see, because even the most cynical, even the most disenchanted of us, at some level, I suppose, we believe that the state exists for some sort of welfareist purpose, that it takes the general good seriously. But, there's no reason why we should take that seriously, because you look at these endless climate conferences, endless conversations around climate justice, all of which assume that, from this Rawlsian perspective, that everybody wants a just outcome. Now, exactly the opposite has happened in America over the last 30 years. All the legislators, and not just America, in India, everywhere, all the legislation has actually been geared towards cementing structures of injustice, So, when we look ahead to what lies ahead, I think we're looking at something just completely Darwinian, really. I mean, that's what they're unleashing upon the world.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up where you started with denial, and thank you for your remarks there. We've had versions of this conversation a few times, and it's had a big effect on how I think about these things, but I still sometimes revert to my my old ways of talking about it. We scientists talk about denial, and so I want to sort of speak here from the perspective of a scientist, and we're a small group, but I think in the climate debate and some of these other debates, we're an influential one, and how we think is picked up on by a lot of other people. And when we're confused about something, we confuse others. So I think, it's okay for me to talk about it. I mean, I think we scientists are quite naive in how we perceive the way our work is used in the world or influences the world. Most of us are anyway. We're not taught anything about it in our education. We're just taught how to do science. Science is really, the way you learn how to be a scientist is really kind of an old, it's an apprenticeship. You just you learn how to do it, and we don't learn anything about the context. So we say, Greta says, listen to the science. And when she says that, you can interpret that a number of ways, but it's kind of a scientism form of thinking. I mean, the implication is that if you accept the conclusions that scientists draw about how the world works, you'll be led inevitably to a certain view of what actions humans should take. That we're warming the climate, it's going to cause huge amount of harm, and so it's obvious that we should change the way we live to at the global scale and the national scale to avert the worst of it, and that assumption just isn't true. And as you said, Amitav, and we've seen that over the years. And the story of climate science, there's a great book by historian Joshua Howe called Behind the Curve, where he described the history of climate science in the US since the 1950s as a tragedy, with the scientists as the tragic heroes. And the tragedy is that they keep thinking that if they just explain the science, the right things will happen. And over decades and decades, it proves not to be true. And the scientists just don't understand why it isn't working. And, we can see it as a sort of crisis of expertise, but we just don't grasp this. I think if you ask individual scientists, they will, is climate a science problem or a political problem? A lot of them would agree it's a political problem. I mean, in other words, not that science and politics are totally decoupled. Of course, they're connected in all kinds of ways, and the scholars of science and technology studies will tell us that. But that we won't solve the problem without having different leaders. There's no scientific advance that will resolve the climate problem at this point. It takes action by leaders. That's not happening. And the question is, but we scientists act as though that's not true. So you can find papers where people actually calculate the value of climate projections by assuming a sort of ideal decision maker who's making the best decision they can, giving the information on how to decarbonize the economy. But there's some uncertainty about climate prediction. So as that uncertainty narrows, you can make a better decision. And you can say, based on that, the value of climate science is so many billions of dollars. But it's completely fictional. In other words, no such leader exists. And we know that, but we still sort of behave as though it's true. And the question I've been struggling with over the last few years, and I think I'm in an earlier stage than you, Amitav, as you sort of thought about how to write differently. I haven't gotten to your stage of knowing how to cope with it. But the question is, how should scientists behave in a situation where, we're accustomed to being sort of part of the power structure. I mean, we're funded by the federal government. A lot of our science grew out of the military. I mean, we consciously or not, we think of ourselves as on the side of the powerful in society. But we aren't now. I mean, we're sort of in opposition to it. And that's profoundly disorienting. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep doing science, but it means that I think we have to, if we want to feel that we're accomplishing anything good in the world, we have to rethink a bit how we're doing it. And I'm still struggling with that.
I have quite a lot to add there, but I don't know, maybe Nikhil, you want to take this conversation in some other direction?
Oh, go ahead, go ahead.
Okay. So, as far as I can see, I think that's very insightful, everything you said. The issue here for scientists is that they think of the world on an analogy with the laboratory. So if something is disproved in the laboratory, or if something is proved in the laboratory, everyone acts accordingly. But as you say, the world is not like that. The world is completely different, and it's very highly politicized and so on. But, I think one of the problems in relation to our, I would say, planetary crisis, it's not just climate, it's, is that all of this, our information in relation to this crisis has come from scientists. Because it's not that other people haven't noticed. I mean, if you talk to farmers, if you talk to, let's say, just a woman who has to fetch water and has to walk further and further and further, every passing year. Or you talk to fishermen, most of all. Fishermen will tell you these absolutely terrifying stories. And, many, many people have noticed that the climate changing. Peter Basso, in his book on the Western Apache, gives a wonderful example of this the Apache elder who notices that the climate is changing through the mismatch between place names and what's happening in those places. Streams have dried up, certain kinds of vegetation have disappeared. So it's not that people haven't noticed this thing, but the people who notice are simply because they're close to the land, they're the most marginalized. They're the ones who are least heard. So in a way, the fact that we have all this information coming only from climate scientists isn't just because only climate scientists have noticed. It's because the structure of power in the world is such that scientists can make their voices heard to those in power. Sadly, they can't make their voices heard loud enough because, as you say, they have a certain proximity to power. Their work is shaped by a certain kind of power. But again, they're marginal to that power, So there's a very interesting dynamic of power at work in the ways in which we even conceive of climate science. There is no other field in the world which is so completely defined by the expertise around it. I mean, you see, even when writers come to to writing about climate, the first thing they'll do is sit and go through a certain number of scientific books and papers, like I did. We feel we have to come to this by getting ourselves clued up, because only the science can tell us about it. You just think about it. There's no other field of modern life which is so completely defined by the expertise around it. And all that expertise is produced by Western institutions of learning, universities, think tanks, and so on. Think of the economy. Of course, we all accept that economists have important things to say about it. But none of us would say that, say, workers don't have something important to say about the economy, or that chief executives don't have something important to say about the economy. But in relation to climate, it's become a situation where it's completely enclosed within its own world. And sadly, I have to say that a lot of it is also just, turf protection. A certain kind of technocracy has seized hold of this. They're extremely impatient of anyone else trying to have a voice or to say anything to it. I mean, I've been to some of these conferences, I mean, they don't even care to listen to anyone who's not, a credentialed expert, as it were. So, I mean, forget the poor indigenous person who's, who's seen this unfolding at first hand. Forget the farmer. It's become that tough, and this is the worst aspect of it. This is a part of this sort of cascading catastrophe, If more farmers' voices, if more voices of fishermen and so on had been heard in the public square, I think people would take the threat much more seriously today.
Well, I think there's one positive thing we should mention here. I think I agree mostly with what you said, but there's, I think, one thing that has changed recently, which is the youth activists.
Yeah.
And I think what's important there is not just that they exist and that they're doing something, but that I think they've framed the problem correctly. I mean, Greta says, listen to the science, but I think that's actually an anomaly in terms of how these young people frame their message. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, scientists have defined the agenda too much. And you could say, if we just think about the sort of industrialized Western world for a moment, you could say that in the beginning it was reasonable. That was reasonable because, you don't know that you have a human problem until you can show. I mean, you have to show not only that the climate is changing, but that it's due to carbon emissions. I mean, you have to establish that. There was a time, decades ago, when it was appropriate to treat it as a science problem because that needed to be established. But that's now been the case, we know that for decades, so that part is over. And it's taken a long time, that initial framing led it to being, marginalized, not only in the ways you said, but in the media. Climate was only in a sort of the environment section of the paper, which, I mean, now that's changed in the New York Times and the Washington Post, but it used to be that it was buried, in a sort of section only for the nerds who cared about it. And so it was like a niche audience of like Birkenstock wearing hikers or something that were, interested in it. I mean, but what's changed with these young activists is that not only are they really, really serious and making their lives about this problem, but they're framing it as a social justice problem. I mean, listen to the science is not what they normally say. They say, you guys are killing us. What are you doing with our future? We have to change, and they're framing it in a way that it's a social justice problem that's related to all the other social justice problems. So I find that tremendously heartening and really a striking departure from the kind of overall trend that you described, Amitav. I think it's fundamentally new what they're doing.
I agree with you. And the great thing about Greta is that, she says, listen to the science all the time, but she also visits indigenous communities, spends time with indigenous communities and so on. And I think she's chosen this, let's stick to the science kind of thing because it's politically more feasible or something like that.
Yeah.
No, I completely agree. I think these young people are amazing. Absolutely.
Amitav, one of the things that you and Adam talked about in the podcast, which I recommend all of you to listen to, was wonderful, around the rise of Sunrise and a whole bunch of youth activists all over the world, is around the necessity or the duty of hope, the duty to hope. And I think the hope you're talking about here may not be the same as liberal hope. What kind of hope did you have in mind when you're thinking about hope and action for the future?
See, the liberal hope that you're talking about, actually it comes out of an idea of unending progress. And really we forget actually how recent this idea of progress is. A young writer called Ben Ehrenreich has just written a wonderful book called Desert Notebooks. And in it, he actually talks not so much about climate as about the underlying ideas, and he really takes up this idea of progress and shows you, look, progress in the end is a completely racially inflected thing. It was always meant to reflect certain racial inequities, social inequities, class inequities. Because when people thought about progress, it wasn't that it was progress for all of mankind. I mean, they knew, in the 18th century, 19th century, when they're talking about progress, they're also talking about exterminate all the brutes and so on. And that was thought to be progress, as I said in my lecture. So I think we have to radically depart from this hope, despair, opposition, and try and think about this in a different way. Because I think, I feel a lot of trust and hope in these young activists and so on. At the same time, we would be really sort of deluding ourselves if we didn't accept also that the other side is almost always one step ahead. I mean, just think of what happened in Paris in 2016. Within 10 days, the French government had locked down 44 climate activists under house arrest. How did they know? Activists are now constantly being identified as, as terrorists and so on. There's an interesting book actually called Green is the New Red, kind of a hair-raising book. So, the other side is gearing up as well. And, the other side has a lot of power. So we must not underestimate, what's happening, on the other side, so to speak. So one way or the other, I think a lot of really bad outcomes are ahead. I think we all know that, So in the face of that, what do we do? And I think we really have to do away with this hope, despair opposition and try to think of it in terms of duty, how we persevere against all these forces.
Thank you. I think we should actually move to the questions. I'm just noting the time. But before we do, I really liked what you were talking about in terms of who gets to tell the climate story. And there's power in who tells stories. I think who has to listen to those stories, or who gets to listen to those stories. And I wanted to just point people to the Climate Stories initiative that has been taking place at the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities, where a whole range of stories have been collected and archived by many from all over the world, precisely to pluralize the stories that get told around climate and who's authorized to tell them. One of the people that have been working on that project, April Anson, I'm going to call on you wherever you are in the Zoom chat. You had a question around climate denial and power that I thought you might want to ask.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much to Adam, Dr. Sobel, and Dr. Ghosh. I've been thinking a lot about, just to tag back to your mention, Dr. Ghosh, of ecofascism yesterday. And the relation to this slippage that you're talking about right now between climate denialism and ecofascism. And I've been really thinking a lot with Jedediah Purdy's new book, This Land is Our Land. And in there, he says that climate denial isn't really about a kind of refusal, which is how I think the left is often understanding it as, but really, he says it's not because they don't recognize the kind of plurality of the world that we live in. It's precisely because they do recognize that the living with each other is encroaching so close as to trigger this kind of defense response. And so I'm just thinking about, the rhetoric as you're talking about that's being weaponized from the right about habitat loss, extinction, genocide, extermination, all of these terms that have been so dear to climate communication are now being weaponized for wall building and for, even more vicious and visceral attacks. And so I'm wondering about if you see any space there to recuperate that language, or because it is kind of already militaristic, if there's a different set of rhetorical tropes that both of you find more useful or generative.
Adam, would you like to go first?
Sure. I mean, I don't know that I can answer the part. It's a great question. I don't know that I can answer the part about rhetorical tropes. I don't think I have a solution there. But I think what you raise is something that it allows me to sort of expand on the problem I was trying to struggle with before, which is the problem of denial and how we understand denial and the sort of scientism that colors this. Because when the left and right have a disagreement about climate science, or what's framed as a disagreement about climate science, where the left is saying, it's a real problem, it's real, it's real, it's us, it's bad, we have to do something. And the right is saying, no, your models are are bad. You know, the climate has warmed before and so on. Actually, in that debate, both sides are agreeing that science is the important thing, at least on the face of it. In other words, they're choosing to frame the argument in terms of science. And I think Amitav is completely right that the so-called denial is just a smokescreen. I mean, the people, you know, I think most of the Republicans in Congress believe in climate science regardless of what they say. And I have colleagues who have had chances to have conversations with them where they say this privately. They just won't say it publicly because they think they'll be voted out of office. But, and that's happened actually to one Republican senator who did change his views and was, I forget the fellow's name, Inglis, happened a few years ago.
Yeah.
Anyway, you know, what's happening is the right is choosing to frame it as an argument about science and the left is sort of taking the bait. When really what the real message is, you know, as Amitav says, yes, this is happening, but we don't care because it's going to hurt other people that aren't our problem. And, you know, the thing is that that's just a tactic. I think what scientists and everybody else who believes that we should be acting on climate needs to understand is that the denial is just a tactic. The tactic could change. And so you brought up the eco-fascism. You know, that's an example where one chooses just not to be in denial, but simply to say, you know, the outcome is okay with me. I mean, what most of us here would see as a terrible outcome is fine, you know, because of social Darwinism, because of racism and colonialism and all these things. So, you know, it's a very strange position. I mean, I come back to the view of the scientist because it's my life, but it's very strange that the denial puts us in a frame where we're sort of comfortable because we like arguing about science, we're good at it, we're trained at it. So even though it makes us furious and angry and confused when the person doesn't listen to us, but at the same time, it sort of pokes us in a comfortable, you know, place, and we keep having this argument that is completely pointless. So I don't know if I've answered the question, but I don't have an argument. I don't have a, you know, I don't know how to change the language. I think that was the main point of the question. Maybe Amitav has some thoughts on that.
Well, you know, scientists are people who produce knowledge. So they think of denial as a cognitive failure rather than as doublespeak. You know, certain things just can't be said today because we don't allow them to be said. We can't say, I mean, a leader can't say, okay, let a lot of people die. But that's what they're actually saying. You know, I mean, I saw yesterday someone describe, a doctor describe this, the pandemic policy that the Trump administration has adopted as basically default massacres. You know, and I think that's really what they have in mind. That is, these a kind of default ecocide. Secondly, you know, I think we really can't abstract this from the history of settler colonialism, because you have to remember that for the settler colonial, disease in the end is always on his side. You know, it takes care of the other side. It takes care of, you know, those who you're up against. It's actually one of the weapons you unleash on them, you know. And there's a very interesting study of New Orleans, actually, where, you know, yellow fever and responses to yellow fever became absolutely weaponized in this way. You know, so there's a long history of this, and we cannot abstract this. I mean, I always think of it, you know, when I go out for a walk in my neighborhood, who are the people who are not wearing masks? You know, 9 times out of 10, it's a young white man. You know, I'm sure they're not racists. They don't see themselves as settler colonials, but deep within their hearts, they have a kind of belief of the incorruptibility and the strength of the white body. You know, because it's something that's come down to them through time, where they feel that health and wealth will protect them against the ravages of a disease like this. And of course, very often it does. So yeah, I think it's absolutely, I mean, ecofascism is all around us now. I mean, you know, simply because it doesn't register so much in the mainstream media or, you know, in the circles that we inhabit, we tend to think of it as a fringe idea, or we tend not to take it very seriously. But during this pandemic, it's become absolutely clear. Like the Chief Justice of Wisconsin said the other day, oh, the people who died in that town, they weren't regular people. They were just meat packers. You know, I mean, the absolutely blatant way in which this is being put on the table, I think we cannot abstract it from history.
That's great, actually. And you know, one of the things that's coming up as you're talking about denial as a tactic, based on this assumption, Adam, that you were talking about, that it's somebody else's problem, in some ways also betrays a sense of superiority that we, white men, are invincible, right? Or we, the United States, is invincible. And one of the things that came out in that conversation, again, that you guys had, is this is based on understanding that the trouble is always going to happen somewhere else, something that the COVID epidemic has laid lie to in very visceral and very evident ways in the United States, albeit more on Black and brown bodies. That the pandemic is here more than anywhere else. But anyway, I think I just wanted to bring that up because one of the things that is happening is climate change, as Amitav points out, is happening. You know, the US is as affected in so many ways. I think Judy had a question about gender and climate change. Judy, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Yeah, just thinking about the observation that well known among social scientists that conservative white men are the most resistant to climate action, and also that the most politically effective youth leaders right now are young women.
Mm-hmm.
What your thoughts are on the relationship between gendered power dynamics and climate change? You know, we've talked a lot about colonialism and capitalism, and I think that there's a lot. I'd like to hear some, you know, how you're thinking about that as well, about gender power.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a lot of I don't know that I have a good answer, but there's a lot of discussion and activity now on gender in science itself, including in climate science. My own laboratories where I work, there's been intense discussions about that in the last decade or so. And I can't say that everything's great as a result of it, but there is an improved awareness and an improved gender balance in the scientific community that works on this problem. But the fact that the climate activists are, the leaders anyway, are young women, I don't know what to say about that, except it's a welcome development. I mean, I think it's wonderful that these young women are not afraid to lead and are very, very eloquent, very well-spoken, very forceful and compelling. Varshini Prakash, the leader of Sunrise, and many others. I mean, I guess I think there's no question that there is that gender is a big factor in all of these things. I mean, both within and without the science and in the political sphere as well. So the fact that, you know, that young women are leading these movements is expressing something very real and very powerful. And I don't know what else to say about it, except I think it's wonderful, and I hope that their momentum keeps up, and maybe it'll change how we think about these problems.
Well, you know, you're absolutely right to point out that so many of the most important activists are women. But I think it's also important to point out that many of the most important thinkers about climate are women. You know, Naomi Oreskes, Naomi Klein, Rebecca Solnit, Sunita Narayan. I mean, it's just a very long list. And I think, again, you know, Elizabeth Colbert is such a powerful writer on these issues. Again, you know, it's kind of interesting to see also the differences between, say, let's say, the science fiction produced by women and that produced by men you know, on these issues. I mean, Ursula Le Guin, for example, her take on the future, Octavia Butler, so many others.
Yeah, N.K. Jemisin.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
Adim, Suhail has a question about techno-utopianism. Adim, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the discussion. I have a baby running around, so this will be slightly, I'll ask my question really quickly. I was wondering if we could sort of address the other side of denial, which is a certain kind of an ally that is emerging within sort of big tech, which is sort of promoting this idea of designing smart cities, not denying the disasters that are impending, but actually accepting them and saying that we as human beings, as inhabitants of these coastal cities, should perhaps start accepting a very different kind of an existence moving in the future. And Orit Halpern has written a lot about it, Gökçe Gönül, about a kind of a world in which sort of what it means to be a human inhabitant of these cities has to change, and we need to sort of let in more surveillance, more technologies into our lives, and perhaps to address that kind of an ally that actually acknowledges climate change and then says, okay, now we need to think about different ways of being human.
Yeah. I actually, you know, I'm half appointed in an engineering school, which has a data science initiative. And one of the activities within that is a smart cities initiative. So it's very much, I'm not involved in it really, but you know, it's close to me. And so it's something that not only the tech industry, but academia, you know, is thinking about. And I mean, you know, no one wants to say that cities should be dumb, but yeah, it's such a fine line, you know. Technology has such power to improve things, but also so many downsides. And we're seeing, you know, the internet. I was listening to a podcast the other day with some psychologists talking about how the internet is sort of a mass experiment in human psychology that we've all been subjected to without really agreeing to it. You know, that social media and email and everything has like profoundly affected how we think, and nobody really understands that. And all these things like smart cities are going to be the same. And one is really torn, because on the one hand, you know, we've talked about the failure of US governance and how we're going to see hundreds of thousands of deaths in the United States because of a sort of passive federal response that's fine with that number of deaths. When we know that it's possible to contain and stop the disease, because many countries have done it already, essentially, but some of them, South Korea, for example, have done it by what we would consider very invasive surveillance, where everybody carries an app on their phone that tracks them all the time. And so you know who you've been in contact with. You don't need human contact tracers because your phone does it. And as someone who, again, as a scientist, I have this sort of technocratic impulse that I have to fight against. But it's, you know, on one hand, I have the impulse of saying, oh, what, you know, why can't we have a good government like South Korea that tries to deal with the problem in the best possible way? You know, but on the other hand, those kind of big brother measures do make one nervous. I don't know. So it's very challenging, but one has to be very skeptical of a world governed by algorithms, because the algorithms are not objective. They build in all kinds of biases that are not necessarily even understood by the people who make them. And so all kinds of things that now are controlled by human beings, when they become controlled by algorithms, the outcomes can be very, very problematic.
I think there's no doubt that, you know, this whole field of green enterprise has become, you know, is being taken over by a lot of corporations, capitalists, and so on. But the thing that really worries me most is geoengineering, because there can be no doubt that at some point they're going to thrust it upon us. And if there's one constant to the history of technology, is that it's a long story of unintended consequences. I mean, after all, you know, greenhouse gases were an unintended consequence. that we find out about, when it's too late. So that's the thing that really does worry me the most, because I think the way they're going to sell it to us, and they're already doing that. You see the normalization of geoengineering that's happening on websites that are run by Harvard, by Yale. You can see this is coming at us. And they're going to sell it to us by saying there is no alternative. We have to engineer the whole thing.
Just to be clear, I think in case everybody isn't up on the geoengineering Amitav is referring to here, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is geoengineering by solar radiation management. So putting tiny particles, sort of like dust, up in the stratosphere to reduce a little bit the amount of sunlight coming in, thus cooling the climate and responding, reducing global warming. And there's other forms of geoengineering which would be less invasive, but that don't work yet, like carbon capture and storage. But that technology doesn't exist in a way that's useful. Geoengineering by solar radiation management, we know is doable because volcanoes already do it. They spew dust into the, tiny, not dust, but sulfuric acid aerosol particles, which cool the climate. Mount Pinatubo did that in the 90s, cooled the planet by around ½ degree or a degree, I can't remember, Celsius, for about a year. And so it's definitely doable. It's not that expensive. A single country could do it. You'd need to fire some rockets or some airplanes in the stratosphere, but not only an individual country, wouldn't even have to be a very rich country. Even a single billionaire could do it, but it would affect the whole planet's climate. And the upside is it would reduce global warming. The downside is it would reduce it in a sort of uneven way and have all kinds of unintended consequences, not least of which is that you have to keep doing it. If you ever stop doing it, the warming snaps right back. And so you have a kind of addiction to this technology. And there's worries that it would reduce the monsoons in Asia and have other bad effects. But unlike global climate negotiations to reduce emissions, which require agreement from all the countries to emit less carbon, geoengineering doesn't require any agreement. One country or even one billionaire could do it. So this sort of, it sort of becomes almost inevitable that will happen because you don't have to have, it's in the absence of real global governance. Somebody sooner or later is going to decide it's in their interest. And you can even imagine wars being started over it. So it's very scary. And any environmental scientist, I think, has a sort of gut reaction that we shouldn't do this because massive interventions that are intentional always have unintended consequences and are a bad idea. At the same time, I will admit that there have been moments when, as we think about sort of just unending, unlimited, just rampant global warming continuing for centuries, there's times when even I have started to be convinced by, oh, geez, maybe this is the only, way out that's possible. So I think when Amitav and I discussed this on the podcast that Nicola mentioned, I think the way he put it that was the most important was to say, well, who decides? That's really the question.
Thanks, Adam, Amitav. We have a question from Malcolm Sen.
Thank you for that. That's a great conversation, and so many ideas flying through my mind at the moment. But I was just thinking about some of these points you mentioned in relation to uncertainty, trying to kind of in a way predict or imagine the future, obviously govern it to some degree. And I was thinking, this current contemporary moment we are in, this moment of the pandemic, and the narrative of uncertainty that is dominant everywhere. But actually, as Adam said, there is nothing new about this particular version of the coronavirus, although it is novel. It's only novel in its zoonotic form. It has been there for a long time. And in many ways, the thing that we were always certain about was such a pandemic happening very, very soon, right? This was a decade ago, that was the prediction. And in many ways, I think this pandemic is also a little allegory of the global climate crisis. And my question is basically on this idea of an uncertain future. It appears to me today that you know, one of the things that is absolutely certain is the future. You know, we have a very good understanding of the way local ecologies will be affected. We have some understanding of which populations will be considered surplus, who will be sacrificed. And I wonder if both Adam and Amitav are also thinking, you know, is there a certain kind of certainty about the politics of this future? Maybe there is a precursor of that future politics in our responses to the pandemic. You know, it's a fairly broad question, but it really is trying to kind of engage with this idea that death of the phrase "the future will be better." You know, we used to say this after the World Wars, but not anymore. So that's the question.
I can't speak to the question of uncertainty because I think Adam would do a better job of speaking about that. But look, I do think that when we talk about uncertainty, when we talk about engineering, when we talk about you know, who will be affected, who won't be affected, I think we are already assuming that we know too much. You know, what we are doing there is that we are again trying to think about the world in a way where the earth and its beings are inert. And that's what we are really seeing today, that it's not inert. So, for example, you know, Alfred Crosby's famous idea that, you know, which was in itself terraforming, the terraforming of the New World, you know, whereby it was turned into Neo-Europes. It's very interesting to me that the parts of the New World that are most hard hit are the most terraformed parts of the New World. You look at California, you look at the American Southwest, you look at the southeastern part of Australia. These are the most intensively terraformed parts of the Earth. They're the most close to being Neo-Europes. And when Alfred Crosby was writing, he took it for granted that this was a done deal, that these were Neo-Europes forever. What we see now is that the Earth is itself shrugging off the ways in which it's been formed. And I think, you know, it sounds kind of like nutty to say this, but it really comes from our sense of not being able to consider the things of this Earth as having history-making and world-making powers of their own. You know, you might say, give me an example. Well, Anna Tsing in her wonderful book, The Mushroom at the End of the Earth, gives us a wonderful example of a forest, you know, that has history-making powers. But, you know, to me, I always think of, because I've written a whole trilogy about the Opium Wars, I keep thinking of opium. You know, opium was weaponized by the Dutch in the 17th century. Then it was industrialized the Dutch took the first steps to turn it into a mass commodity. The British industrialized that process. And all along, their idea was that, you know, opium is a resource that we can use in the ways that we want, and that it'll, you know, we can control what it does. And of course, for a while that worked. But what we see now, you know, if you think of opium through most of the 20th century, people thought opium was a thing of the past. You know, that it was somehow a sort of archaic thing that had disappeared from the earth. But what we see now is that opium does have its own history and world-making powers. That it enters, you know, like a virus, it has its receptors, and those receptors are human pain and greed, and, you know, it inserts itself back into history in ways that are not within human control, you know. And I think this is the aspect of fossil fuels also that we miss, you know, that fossil fuels have enmeshed themselves in human life in ways in which, in some important ways, we are not in control.
I just want to respond a little bit to the other part of the question. I mean, you asked about uncertainty and whether, I don't remember exactly how it was phrased, but something about whether we're seeing the politics of the future emerging now or something. And I think when it comes to the scientific uncertainties around climate change and other environmental and public health problems, you know, I think there's always going to be uncertainties, and the responsible way is to, you know, this is going to sound a bit technocratic, but is to treat them as problems of risk. In other words, if we know there's some possible bunch of outcomes, we have to worry about the worst ones. That's how human beings behave normally in their individual lives. I mean, you don't cross the street thinking, well, there's only a small possibility that a car will hit me if I go against the red light, and we have to behave. We have to have some amount of precautionary principle, and I think that's a fairly simple part of the question. But about the politics, and I think it comes back to the question of hope, and Amitav's saying that we should rather think about duty and what our responsibility is in this moment. I mean, of course, you have to have a little bit of hope of some kind in order to carry out your responsibilities, but you don't have to believe everything is going to get better. You just have to believe that you can have some impact. And I mean, Amitav mentioned Rebecca Solnit. She has a great essay whose name I don't remember, but it's where she talks about social movements of the past and the consequences they had, and things people did that, civil rights movement and other things where people did things that seemed at the time to be totally ineffective, the acts of civil protest and such that at the time didn't seem to accomplish anything. But history kind of plays out in complicated ways, and decades later you could see that those things did have some consequences. And so I think we have to be a little bit humble in our view of history and the future especially. I mean, there's a saying that prediction is hard, especially about the future, and it's really true. I mean, you can see in the politics today all kinds of horrible things happening that look familiar from the late 30s and other periods in history. But we just have to. I think the right question we all should be asking is what should I be doing with myself in this time, and not what are the uncertainties or do I have hope or not, or what's going to happen with the climate or with politics. It's just that's what I've come to. That's the only way to frame it. It doesn't make it easier, but it makes it somehow possible to keep going.
We have time for a couple of last questions. We can take them together. I think they're quite related, by Nivedita Nath and Bethany Wiggin. Nivedita asked me to ask her question on her behalf, and it is, what are some of the concrete steps we can take to break the enclosures of climate science and the neoliberal university? And Bethany, I'll let you ask your own question.
Oh, I think that was well asked. I'll just elaborate by saying that I am so interested in thinking about the practices that might democratize both science, pluralize science, as well as the communities that at universities more broadly, you both might see as making alliances and expanding the active research community to understand themselves also as part of that shaping of the group of the concerned and the group of decision makers, broadly speaking.
Well, for me, it's been great, for example, to collaborate with Adam on this work, and I think something real and important has come out of it. Inevitably, because I myself have a PhD and so on, I interact a lot with universities and university people. But I do know that I would not be able to think about these issues in the ways that I do think about them had I been within a university context. Because the whole context of the university very powerfully defines the ways in which we've come to think about the climate. And I think that first question is a very important question. How do we now break these issues out of the bubble of expertise that they're encircled by?
Yeah, there's sort of two questions. One is how do we break the bubble of expertise, and the other, I think what the question was asking is also how to diversify the group of people that's in the bubble. And that's a question that's getting a lot of attention in academia and in the sciences now. I don't think anybody has easy or wonderful solutions, but it's a radical change in the last couple of years from all the time before that in my career. So I don't know. That's some kind of small progress at least, but I think the other thing that's happening is I do think that this is really new, but I think the very youngest people entering my field are thinking of themselves as trying to contribute somehow to the real climate problem in the world, and that's part of their motivation. And on the one hand, you know, I'm almost tempted to discourage them because I don't think that science is really the solution at this point. On the other hand, it's wonderful. We're talking about breaking the bubble. So, I mean, the only way that the sciences can engage more deeply with the people around them in the society and democratize it, as you say, is if the scientists want to do that. And so seeing the young people who have that impulse is encouraging. I think Amitav is absolutely right. The structures of the university don't really make this easy. I mean, our collaboration, well, it ended up being a little bit facilitated by the university through this Mumbai Center, but basically all my activities of writing and thinking about these things from a broader perspective are sort of outside my normal job. I mean, the dean likes it, but it wouldn't get me tenure, you know, if I was young. I mean, so, you know, that's another question is how, and Columbia University, from the president, I mean, he really wants, he's doing this thing called Columbia World Projects where he wants us to be more engaged in the world and making a difference, quote unquote, and doing things outside of our normal research and education. But it's, but the institutions themselves are, despite the liberal politics of everybody in them, the institutions themselves are quite conservative in many ways, and Amitav's right about that.
You know, one thing also that I should point out is that I'm very happy here today to see here there are so many people from other parts of the world participating in this conversation, but the whole discourse on climate is a very Western-centered discourse. You know, the people who participate in it are, you know, not only based in universities, they're almost, I would say, probably 70–80% Westerners. As you yourself said, Adam, you know, the work on the Indian Ocean, there's so little of it, you know, compared to what exists elsewhere. So that in itself, you know, just to have attribution studies done in places, you know, like India, like China, elsewhere, I mean, that's a very small way in which it could be extremely useful.
Yeah, it's true. And, you know, I think it's interesting if you go to India and talk to the scientists in my field, and I've done this a bunch of times, there's many excellent ones. Relatively few of them working on the climate change problem. Most of them working on seasonal prediction of the monsoons. That's overwhelming. Not even many working on cyclones, actually. And I think that's historically, I've done a little bit of reading on this, and I think it's because historically, the climate problem was seen even within India as a sort of Western thing. In other words, not that people didn't believe it, but with some justification, the view was, well, the Western countries are burning all the fossil fuels and doing this to us, and somehow so to engage in the climate research, which was done by the, you know, sort of facilitated by the IPCC in support of the international negotiations, would be somehow to get caught up, would be somehow a disadvantage in the international, you know, to engage in those negotiations would somehow be a disadvantage. I think that's changed over time. There was an episode in the last IPCC report where there was a real major error in one of the predictions about Himalayan glaciers melting in Working Group 2. Somebody said they were going to melt much, much faster than any projected. It wasn't, it was just scientifically wrong. And in the US, that played out as an argument with between the deniers and the scientists, with the deniers saying, oh, God, look, you guys screwed it up. And the scientists saying, oh, well, it was just one little mistake in one part of the report, whatever. But in India, it was a huge deal. It showed to the Indian scientists that Westerners really weren't putting enough effort into understanding what was happening in South Asia. And it led to a little more engagement, actually. So I think, you know, it's not to blame the victim, but to say that it would be great to have more science coming from the whole world. And I think it's happening, but it's slow.
Yeah. You know, and I think this one of the things that you're bringing up and bringing forward here is that a lot of the climate change concern, science, action continues to be very much located in some parts of some worlds, right? In the university, largely white, oftentimes male, but then also among the upper classes. There was a question that came earlier that we didn't have a chance to ask around how if climate change is an issue in India, it's oftentimes within the high consumer upper classes, and it's hard for that kind of discussion framed around climate activism, although I don't think it's around livelihood issues as much, to resonate, right? And I think one of the challenges is to populate climate stories from others, right? Like Amitav was saying, from farmers, from fishers, from those who can already tell you that the earth is changing, and how to make those register as forms of both climate thinking and climate activism is a challenge I think all of us confront, definitely within but also beyond the university. And maybe at some point in the future we should bring in, the way we have had a chance to bring both of you, those self-same activists in the Sundarbans, in Sunrise, to think with us about how to carry on that important work of thinking beyond the constituencies of climate concern that are important, but definitely need to expand beyond the walls we have here. But we're actually out of time. And so I just wanted to thank both of you so much for this incredible conversation. It's been such a pleasure, and we do hope to have a chance to continue it on in the years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nikhil.
Thank you.
And Meg and Bethany, everyone who organized it. Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. That was great.